Welcome back to the Dean Obeidallah Show. Right now, very happy to have on for the first time, Professor Richard Hasen, UCLA law professor, one of the nation's leading experts on election law, heads the Safeguarding Democracy Project at UCLA, is author of the book, A Real Right to Vote. Professor, nice to see you. Thanks so much for making time for being on. I know you're busy. I see you on all different cable shows and media appearances, and you're really making people smarter on this, so I appreciate you being here.
Well, when you see me a lot on TV, it means the country's in trouble.
I get that there are certain people I know that the only time, like my friend Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who's an expert on authoritarianism, she says when she's on TV a lot, it's never good. It's never like, hey, let's kill some time with Ruth. It's always, how is this going to end? So let's
Right.
talk about Donald Trump now. His latest thing is to want to nationalize the election. And I wanted you to tell us from a constitutional point of view, what is the reality about this in terms of who runs the elections?
Well, states run the elections and they give a lot of their power to counties. What the Constitution says, it says nothing about state elections at all. And it says that as far as congressional elections go, this is in Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution, that states make the rules for the time, place, and manner of these elections, but Congress can override them. So Congress could impose rules, and it has from time to time imposed rules on how federal elections are run. It might be possible, if Congress passed a law, to actually put in a national system of election administration. But the president has no role. And we've recently had a couple of executive orders that Trump has issued. I should say a couple of court decisions on an executive order that Trump issued in August. And these courts have said the president has no role to play in the running of elections.
But he doesn't care. I mean, that's the remarkable thing. Of course, he doesn't. Is it, and I want to go through the legal stuff, but is it relevant in the discussions that people have in corporate media about Trump and wanting the SAVE Act and election integrity when this is the man who was convicted of 34 felonies for cheating in the 2016 election? That's what Alvin Bragg talked about, the DA. It wasn't about paying hush money. It was about rigging the election, and then attempted a coup and was charged with 4 felonies after the 2020 election. Is it a disservice if the corporate media doesn't give context for who the messenger is who's claiming he wants election integrity, given his own track record?
Sure. Well, I think that, there's this question about taking Donald Trump seriously or literally.
Right.
I don't think he has a well formed out plan to nationalize elections, but I would take all of his comments together as someone who could well try to interfere one way or another with the 2026 elections. I was really taken by one of the regrets that Trump expressed. I think it was last month. He regretted that he didn't seize voting machines in 2020. The 2020, just to remind you, that was the COVID election between Trump and Biden. In that election, Trump lost, and he filed about 60 lawsuits trying to overturn the results of the election, and he failed. He was president at the time, and he's saying he should have sent troops in to take the ballots. I mean, so that worries me a lot more than his loose talk about nationalizing elections. And I do think we have to be paying attention to this right now, not the specifics, but the general expression of concern about how the elections are run and what might be done about it.
Yeah, and on some level, you can say the sending the FBI with Tulsi Gabbard to Fulton County is almost a precursor to the idea of sending federal operatives. It could be troops or, in this case, FBI agents who seize hundreds of boxes. What was your reaction to that? And what are your concerns from that action by Donald Trump and his administration?
So I think there's both an optimistic story and a pessimistic story to tell about
Okay.
the Fulton raid. The
Okay.
optimistic story is this is placating Donald Trump, who's a noted voter fraud conspiracy theorist. He's focused a lot of his attention on Georgia, as did Rudy Giuliani, who ended up being found liable for $185 million in damages for defaming 2 election workers in Georgia. So the optimistic story is this is just placating the president. Tulsi Gabbard is also a noted conspiracy theorist. She has apparently, according to reporting in the Wall Street Journal, been tasked to ferret out voter fraud. This keeps her busy so she doesn't interfere with the kind of interventionist stuff that Trump wants to do in Venezuela or Iran or other places. So that's the optimistic story.
That's a nice.
That's not so optimistic, but it's better
Right.
than the alternative. The alternative is this is a test run. And I can't express how dangerous it would be for ballots to be seized by federal agents before an election tabulation is complete. And let me explain what I mean by tabulation. We all vote either early or on election day, and then it takes a while for all of those ballots to be counted. They have to make sure that there's uh, everyone who's voting is eligible to vote.
Right.
There's a chain of custody. In a fair number of places, you can watch a video, it's a very boring video, watch the ballots as they're being stored. Once someone could take ballots away, you worry about ballot box stuffing or about throwing ballots away, then all the things that Trump claims are happening to others, this is the kind of thing that could happen if anyone is touching those ballots. And so this really worries me, much more so than talk about ICE at the polling places and some of the other things that people are spinning their heads about.
So what is your concern? Because ICE is a concern, but yes, I agree. There's not enough ICE agents. They have to intimidate and use the threat of it. What is your concern about what they could do here in terms of, is it coming out and going, look, we found all this massive fraud, and then claim that's why we need to send troops into voting locations? Or is it something with the equipment, affecting the equipment going forward?
So I'm not worried about Trump sending FBI agents into polling places either. Interfering with voters voting is going to provoke a huge public reaction. But
Okay.
there are going to be days after the election when ballots are still being tabulated. I'm here in California. California is notoriously slow in counting ballots because they get so many mail-in ballots, and those ballots have to be checked to make sure that everyone who's voting is eligible to vote. So you can imagine a scenario where the election night results that are announced in California or in Arizona show a Republican narrowly in the lead. The House of Representatives is closely contested. And we know that as more ballots are counted, it can shift, the numbers can shift where a Republican looks like she has more votes to a Democrat. One of the reasons this blue shift happens is because more Democrats than Republicans these days are voting by mail, and more Democrats are voting later. So it's not a random sample. It's not surprising that
Right.
you'd see this blue shift. But people like Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, this week made comments and said, "Oh, well, that's some evidence of fraud." So all of this is to say that it would happen on the back end rather than the front end. Like, it wouldn't be interfering with voting, but you can imagine Trump saying, "Oh, look, all this bad stuff is happening in this place where there's a contested election. We don't trust the states." He said repeatedly in the last few weeks, states are just the agents of the federal government in counting ballots, so we're going to take it over. That's what he might have in mind when he talks about nationalizing the election or taking it over. That's what I worry about.
Yeah, and in the lead up, what they're doing now, the leaning is into the SAFE Act, and also there's the Mega Act. We don't know exactly which one. They're trying to draft something different here that includes this, but we know one component is demanding proof of citizenship. And I saw the Brennan Center estimate about 21 million people wouldn't have the documentation. Can you share? I mean, you're an expert in election, about how many incidences, is it widespread? Have I missed it, of undocumented immigrants voting? Because I would imagine if it's widespread, they can give us countless examples, Republicans, but they don't give us examples. So you're an expert on it. What can you share on this?
So the amount of election fraud in the United States is quite low. And if you think about non-citizen voting, let's go back to 2016. In 2016, that was the election that Donald Trump won, and he beat Hillary Clinton. You may remember that Hillary Clinton won in the popular vote. Well, it's just a beauty contest, right? But he won in the popular vote, and he lost. I'm sorry, Hillary Clinton won in the popular vote. He lost by about 3 million votes. So then he went on ABC News with David Muir, and he said there were 3 million, very, very coincidental. There were 3 million non-citizens who voted. All of them voted for Hillary Clinton. None of them voted for me. So after the 2016 election, there was an extensive look around the country for non-citizen voting. And there weren't 3 million or 300,000 or 30,000 or 3,000 or 300. There were about 30 cases of possible non-citizen voting. And it's not surprising that it's so small. In all these places, they say, "Oh, look, we found thousands of people who might be non-citizen voters. Usually it's some kind of administrative error. So the
Mhm.
person became a citizen and the paperwork didn't catch up, or a person was inadvertently registered to vote at the DMV when they were getting their driver's license or something like that. If you register to vote, you are signing under penalty of perjury that you are a citizen. If you lie about that, you could go to jail, and if you're a non-citizen, you can be deported. Why would non-citizens vote? This idea, it
Okay.
kind of ties in with the great replacement theory. The idea is, they're bringing in these hordes of dark-skinned immigrants who are going to vote out the white people. It's just not happening.
And there's studies that back it up, and it doesn't matter. I mean, I had the Secretary of Minnesota, Secretary of State of Minnesota on yesterday. He talked about a study in Minnesota, and there was one in Utah. I saw the Brennan Center highlighted this, that they looked at voting 2 million registered voters that between April 2025 and January 2026. They found one confirmed instance of a non-citizen registering, but zero voting. And again, I don't know why corporate media doesn't push. This is not about criticize corporate media day. It's something I do every day. Why they don't ask Republicans, give us the examples that back up the need, because as you point out, it's already illegal for a non-citizen to vote in a federal election. There's no doubt about it, and you will be prosecuted. So I already have that law, and so when there is no basis for it and based in fact, what is the concern you have if they pass some version of the SAVE Act, which requires documentation that you're a citizen to register to vote, and even in some cases, actually to show up again when you want to vote?
Well, so we have some experience with documentary proof of citizenship laws. This is what we know. In 2011, Kansas had imposed one of these laws, and there was a trial. I write about it at the beginning of my 2020 book, Election Meltdown. There was a trial. About 30,000 people who were otherwise eligible to register to vote were not registered because they couldn't provide a birth certificate, if they changed their name, also a marriage license or a naturalization certificate or a passport, the things you need. They couldn't. And Chris Kobach, a noted vote denier, who was the co-head of a commission that Trump had in his first administration to look for voter fraud, he went in front of this judge and said that non-citizen voting is a big problem. This is a Republican appointed judge, federal district court judge. And he said, what I've presented is the tip of the iceberg. And the court, in its opinion, said there is no iceberg. There is only an icicle, and it's made up mostly of administrative error. It's the same reason people are listed as having voted in having been born in 1900 or 1800. People make mistakes, or there's data entry mistakes.
Right.
It's really not a problem, but we know it's disenfranchising. If we had it on a national scale, I mean, think about the people who register others to vote in front of Costco. Who's walking around with their passport or their papers? I mean, maybe more people are now given what's going on with ICE, but most people are not. And most people, it's just putting up another barrier to voting that is not doing anything appreciably to prevent fraud. I do not expect the SAVE Act or anything like it to become law in this country, in part because key Republicans, including Mitch McConnell, don't believe that the federal government should have more of a role in the conduct of elections. They're big states' rights kind of people. And so often that works against Democrats and against
Mhm.
those who want to expand voting rights. But in this case, that will likely mean not only would the SAVE Act not get through a filibuster, I don't even think it would get a majority if it got a vote on the floor in the Senate.
I hope that will be the case, because there was just an article in Politico today that the headline is that they are making this a top priority. They're not going to address the economy or high prices. They're going to address this kind of issue. So another part of this is that if it gets enacted as written, it would end universal mail-in ballots in the 8 states that have it. And Trump has always talked about mail-in ballots. Can you share, Professor, is there a history of fraud that, again, that we are missing with mail-in ballots that would necessitate something that makes it easier for vote? I've seen studies that show mail-in ballot, universal mail-in ballots increase the turnout. More people vote. Wouldn't we want more of this?
Well, I think a lot of that is wrong. So first of all, we don't know that, like, you get an increase after a state adopts mail-in balloting, but overall it doesn't seem to do much to increase turnout. Doesn't
Okay.
decrease turnout, makes voting easier. We also do have a history when fraud happens. I wrote about this in my 2012 book, The Voting Wars. When fraud happens, it's much more by voters as opposed to election officials. It's much more likely to happen with mail-in ballots rather than ballots cast in person. That's because the ballots are outside the presence of
Mhm.
election officials. They can be collected, they could be destroyed. We actually had a Republican congressional candidate running in North Carolina. I believe this was back in 2018.
Yeah.
And he had some political operatives who were messing with mail-in ballots, and they had to redo that election. So it happens. It happens occasionally. There's no history in any of the states that have adopted universal mail-in balloting of significant fraud involving mail-in ballots. People are on the lookout for this. So while it is marginally more likely to happen with ballots voted by mail, still the rate at which this happens is quite low. When you see it, it tends to be on a very small election, very small scale, because then you don't need a ton of people engaged in a conspiracy to try and swing an election. I'd point your listeners to Paterson, New Jersey, where it looked like some local city council members were working to cast some fraudulent absentee ballots, and it was enough. I think a few dozen ballots was enough to swing an election. You're not going to swing a presidential election or any kind of statewide election or a congressional election without it being detected through mail-in ballots. If mail-in ballots are taken and people don't get in a lot of states, you get an email, "Hey, your ballot's been received." People wouldn't. We would know if there was a
Sure.
problem.
And what Donald Trump's dream in some Republicans and some Republicans who call my show, the idea of no early voting, no mail-in ballots. You got to come in like the old days and you put your ballot into a box, I guess, that type of scenario. Now we'd have voting machines. What are the concerns if we ended up getting rid of all the early voting days? Everybody had to come in person and vote in terms of the participation rate and being a robust democratic republic.
Well, the problem is that we do not have the capacity in vote centers and in precincts, polling places, to handle all of that volume. Take a look at Texas. Texas is a state that does not allow much mail-in balloting. You have to be over 65 or have an illness that prevents you from getting the polls. During COVID, Texas didn't relax that rule, and you couldn't vote by mail unless you were, actually sick with COVID, but not because of fear of COVID.
Right.
But they have robust in-person early voting. Many states have this. Many states have the opportunity to vote early. And that's voting in the polling place. That's as secure as voting on election day. That is something I would encourage all of your listeners to do if they have the opportunity. That's a way to make sure your ballot's not lost in the mail. You've banked your ballot. You know it's been cast. You don't have to worry about getting to the polls on election day. But it would be bedlam. And it would hurt, not just Democrats, it would hurt all voters. Think about rural areas. They're also going to be not have the capacity to deal with everyone showing up on election day. Certainly not something that could be geared up in time for the midterm elections.
Yeah, it would be impossible to do it one day like the old days as Donald Trump wants to live in. You could have weeks of it, but you want to make it easier for people to vote, not harder to people to vote. Another big issue that's coming up now, and again, it's in this bill, and it actually polls well, which is photo ID. You have a little over 20 states that now have a photo ID requirement. You have others that don't require photo ID. What are your concerns, or should we be concerned? Or is it something where the focus should be on making sure people who can't get the ID, that there's funds from the government to ensure they get the ID and make it as easy as possible for people to prove themselves? Or is this not needed?
Well, on the one hand, we have almost no evidence of impersonation fraud. That is, people showing up at the polls that claim to be someone else. On the other hand, most countries do require ID. Most democratic countries, people have a national identity card, so it's very easy for someone to produce that. We don't have that in the United States. I don't have a problem with voter ID laws so long as they're fairly administered. What that would mean is the state would have to come up with all of the funds to verify people's identity. Right now, if you're poor and you have to come up with the money to find the to get the driver's license, you might need your birth certificate. It's a hassle. If we actually proactively did it, or if the laws, and some of these laws were challenged in court, and states changed their laws. Texas is one place that's like this. South Carolina is another, where you can go to the polling place, and if you don't have the right kind of ID, everybody has some ID, but it's a narrow list of what's accepted. If you don't have the right ID, you can sign an affidavit and say, "I am who I say I am," under penalty of perjury, and if not, come after me and arrest me. And so that kind of affidavit alternative can be kind of a fail-safe. Again, the details really matter here. How hard would it be to get the ID? How would it be administered? Would it be fairly administered? But we do know, if you look at states that have put in place more restrictive voter ID laws, we have not seen an overall decline in turnout, which is somewhat surprising to people who think that all of these laws are suppressive, in part because our election get out the vote efforts are not static. If a state imposes a voter ID law, then it's going to spur more people to go into action to help people get the IDs. And the people who are most marginalized in society, who would have the hardest time getting these IDs, they're also the people who are least likely to vote. We don't have compulsory voting in this country, so those people maybe weren't going to vote anyway. So, if a state wants to impose a fair voter ID law, I would be in favor of something like that if it was coupled with, say, universal voter registration, where all voters who are eligible would automatically be registered to vote by the government. That's not a deal I think that would be taken up, but that would be a nice trade.
I was proposing on my show last night, we discussed it, voter ID for getting big money out of politics. Like we do big voter ID and you take the corrosive power of big money out of our political system. Yeah, I mean, there's organizations like Vote Riders on their own. And I talked to Kathleen Unger, who help people get their ID, having a government fund to mandate. And I was looking at, like, the UK has a system where if you don't have their certain photo IDs, you can get this voting card from them. There's a way around it if we can get something in exchange. And that's more from a political point of view, but to make our election more democratic. What about, because you're an expert on voting, I want to touch on two last things. One is the Voting Rights Act. There's a case before the Supreme Court right now. We're all waiting for a decision coming out of Louisiana. It's deeply concerning. We don't know how they're going to rule, but what are the potential scenarios we can get, and what's the most alarming to you in terms of having an impact on the voting for 2026?
Well, so the case that's before the court right now is called Louisiana versus Calais. It didn't start out as a case where the Voting Rights Act seemed to be in trouble, but the court over the summer set the case for re-argument and seemed to tee up the question of the constitutionality of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. That section is more responsible than anything else for the huge rise in the number of districts, congressional districts and state and local election districts, where minority voters have an opportunity to elect their candidate of choice. It's been really instrumental around the country in making our legislative bodies, including Congress, much more diverse. It sounded to me from oral argument, in the second oral argument in the Calais case, that the court conservatives were likely to either weaken or strike down Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. That would be an earthquake in American politics. That would be, I think, terrible from the point of view of fair representation. But that's the way things look like they're going. And so I'm very concerned about that. And depending on how they write the opinion, it could have a small or large effect on elections overall.
And the impact on 2026, I would imagine, depends on when they release the decision. If they hold it all the way to the end of the term, then potentially it's less likely of an impact. I guess we don't know what this is going to be.
I think it's already unlikely to impact 2026 because most states have already started the processes of voting for congressional elections.
Yeah.
The places are holding primaries in the upcoming months. It would probably be too late to do anything. The other thing is, the Supreme Court works that they don't issue an opinion until everybody who's on the court has had a chance to write their concurrences and dissents. I can imagine if it's going to be an opinion that makes the Voting Rights Act weaker, it's going to take a long time to do this. And we probably won't see a decision till closer to June, when I think it's almost certain that it would not come in time for states to redraw districts in time for the 2026 midterm elections.
That's a good point because, for example, a friend of ours running for Congress in Illinois, it's coming up right away. So last thing, Professor, what can we do to secure our election? And when I say we, I mean, we're not Democratic members of Congress. We're people. We want to make sure people can vote. Is there anything the average person can do between now and election day to secure our elections? And what I mean by that is some people have called into, like what we're seeing with ICE. We should be videotaping any kind of nefarious activity outside of election places, or we should make sure everyone is registered to vote now and know the updates and the laws of their state. Anything you can recommend?
Well, I do think that states and localities need to be ready for possible federal intrusion into voting processes. Maybe they need to go to court to get some, preemptive injunctions. Um, Voting rights groups are certainly thinking about what they need to do. But the average person, what I can say is that our elections are really decentralized. That means that they're really run mostly on the county level. You can be a poll worker, you can be an observer. There's a lot to do there. And also, it's possible that our local election administrators and state elected election officials and elected officials are going to be under pressure from Trump to do the wrong thing. And so we have to be ready to push back and make sure that we have a free and fair election in 2026.
Yeah, and he tried to pressure people to do the wrong thing after 2020. We all remember him pressuring, like in Michigan. It's just not. It's casting the ballot, counting the ballot, and certifying the results are so vitally important. So, Professor, if people want to follow, I know you're on Blue Sky and other places. Where do you recommend if people want to follow your work and learn more about election laws and learn about protecting our democracy?
Well, if you're concerned specifically about the upcoming elections, I direct you to the Safeguarding Democracy Project's website, which is safeguardingdemocracyproject.org. We have a number of webinars and in-person events, and all the videos of these events are recorded. We're having one on the 18th talking about potential contests to elections. Can they happen in Congress, happen in state court or federal court?
Ah,
And the other place to look just for my general work and coverage of these issues is the election law blog, which is electionlawblog.org.
well, Professor, I want to thank you for your time, and I'm going to watch that seminar because I'm deeply concerned about after the election, them trying not to seat certain Democrats for winning congressional races. But Professor, thank you. Have a great weekend, and I look forward to hopefully you'll come back on. Love to chat with you in the future.
It was great to be with you.
Take care.